So welcome again to our Winemakers Research Exchange virtual sensory session, where we'll be talking about managing potassium and acidity in Petit Verdot. Before we jump into all of our stuff today, I do have a couple of questions, poll questions to ask you guys, just to get an idea of where you're coming from when you're thinking about that acidity that happens in Petit Verdot. So let me go ahead and launch that. The questions here: just when you're making Petit Verdot, how often do you need to add acid? Is it just a seldom kind of thing, or are you adding it all of the time? So what portion of the time are you adding your acid? When you add acid, when in your winemaking are you doing that? And this is sort of a mark all that applies. So if you're adding at the crusher and after alcoholic and after mallet, go ahead and click all three of those. What's your sum total add of acid for Petit Verdot? So when you sort of mark all of that up, how much are you actually adding? And what kind of target are you looking for when you kind of are doing your acidulation for Petit Verdot? So, and we're basically asking all of those questions because oftentimes we might see Petit Verdot acidity look something like the graph we see in front of us. So we might have like really nice pHs coming in. This one started at about 3.23, it looks like, but then by the time we're finished with fermentation, we're sort of all the way up at about 3.9, which means we have some sort of acidity management questions to think about along the way. So just a few minutes here, or just a couple minutes while we get the rest of your answers. So go ahead and answer those questions. Okay, looks like we've only about oh, there we go. A few more coming in. I think my internet might be slow updating our numbers there. Okay, so let me go ahead and share those results and we can look at them together. So it does look like this is not a common problem that people are having to acidulate most of the time or a lot of the time with our Petit Verdot. It looks like we have that happening at a number of different time points, but really trying to do that early at crush and during fermentation, and then maybe topping off as we need to further on. And these add rates are relatively high considering what we might be adding to other varieties. So somewhere between 1 and 2, even up to 3.5 grams per liter. Those are pretty high rates. And so we clearly do have an acidity question there. And it looks like when we're looking for our targets for Petit Verdot, we're sort of in this kind of 3.6, 3.7 kind of ish range. And we'll talk a little bit about those targets too as we keep going. So let's see, there we go. So before we start, really the part that we're going to be talking about today is really going to be focusing on the role of potassium in our acidity problem with Petit Verdot. There are probably other issues as well, but potassium seems to be a big player in that. Just to start out though, we kind of need to remember that potassium's not all bad. A lot of what we're going to be talking about with potassium today is like ways to get rid of it. But potassium's not all bad. It's actually really needed by the plant. So here in Virginia, because we generally have lower pH soils and we generally have a fair amount of clay in our soils, we do have very abundant potassium for our plants. There's a lot of research that's been done in terms of how well or not well your soil sample might predict how much potassium gets into your plant. That's well beyond what we're able to have time to talk about today. But I would encourage you, if you haven't looked into that literature, Tony Wolfe has done some really good work with that, as have Bubba Beasley and Lucy Morton, just talking about what's happening in the soil there. But either way, a lot of potassium is available to our vines to take up through their root systems. And that uptake is happening mostly by diffusion, but it's diffusion that goes through transport proteins. So basically anything that makes diffusion happen more is going to make more potassium come from our soils into our plants. So things like moisture, of which we have a lot, warmer temperatures, which we have, and some of that may be genetic, just how many transport proteins you actually have in those rootstocks. And rootstocks have been shown to have an effect on how much potassium comes in. There's lots of different management strategies to try to limit that potassium. Most of you guys are already doing all of that. And to some degree, there's so much potassium that's available, it just drives that diffusion into the plant. Once it gets into the plant, it's really highly mobile. It goes through the vascular system of the plant, so it readily gets to all of the places it needs to go. And it does need to go to some places. Potassium is important for vine growth. It's important for the pollen tubes to form in order to get good germination. It's important for loading sugar from the leaves into the vascular system and then into the grapes themselves. So we need to have potassium as part of that. And it's also part of gas exchange. So it helps to open and close the stomates. That's regulated by potassium as well. So potassium's not entirely a bad guy. When we see potassium in cells, it also has an important role in cells. So it's important in helping to maintain the pH of the cell, which we'll talk about in a little bit more in a minute. It helps to stabilize our cell membranes. It's important for cell expansion and as cofactors with enzymes. So it really does have an important role in what's going on in the plants. When we look at potassium in our grapes themselves, once they get to the grapes, we can see most of that is sort of loaded in at the same time as the sugar and the berry mass expansion, which makes sense for those roles that we just talked about. But it is helpful to remember that it's not found in the same proportion all over the grape. So when they sort of look at where the potassium is in the grape, it is somewhat different by varietal and cultivar, but generally the skin cells have a lot more potassium than the pulp does. That makes sense. The pulp, we know the pulp does have potassium. That's why you have to do cold stabilization. But it's really when you start to skin contact your whites or you start to do red wine fermentations and you have a lot of skin contact, that's where we see our potassium levels go up. And oftentimes that's where we see the loss of acidity that goes along with that. So I keep putting together potassium and acidity. So there's a couple of different mechanisms by which our potassium is affecting the acidity in our grapes and therefore in our wine. And that sort of goes back to what's happening on the cellular level. So on the cellular level, when the cells are making the acid molecules themselves, like tartaric acid and malic acid, they're made as an intact molecule. But part of being an acid is that under some circumstances, hydrogen ions will dissociate from the parent molecule, sort of float off into the juice itself or into the cytoplasm in this case. So when that happens, you sort of have a hydrogen ion that floats away, and then you have the parent anion, the tartrate anion, for example. And that happens with malic acid as well. So when that's happening, you end up having a lot of these hydrogen ions that have dissociated from their parent acids floating around inside of the cell. Well, a lot of hydrogen ions, basically pH is a measure of hydrogen ion concentration, and it's a negative measure. So if you have a lot of hydrogen ions in your cell, it drives your pHs down and down and down. So it makes sense. The more acids you make, the lower your pH is going to get. Unfortunately, that can really cause some destabilization of things inside the cell. So a lot of proteins and your membranes can start to get destabilized if you have too low of pH in the cell. So one of the ways that the cells deal with that is basically they start shunting those hydrogen ions outside over the membranes outside the cell. But you can't just throw those outside the cell, because really quickly, if you keep throwing positively charged things on the other side of the membrane, you really quickly get like a charge separation, which can destabilize the membrane, but it also makes it really hard to put more positive charged things on the outside. So instead of just throwing the hydrogen ions out, they basically exchange it for another positive charge. And the most common, other positive charge around is potassium. So there's actually a transport protein that's been found that does this sort of revolving door of hydrogen ions out and potassium ions in. The result of that is that we have fewer hydrogen ions in our cell, which makes the pH of our cells go up. And we also then have a lot of potassium in our cells because we brought them all in actively. And it turns out, because of the way that the dissociation constants work with acids, that the pH of the juice is actually more affected by how much potassium you have than how many organic acids you have. It's a little bit of complex chemistry, which if you're interested in digging into that, please talk to me later and we can talk about how that works. But for our purposes, it's important to just realize how much magnitude that potassium has. So a little bit of change in potassium can change the pH of our cells and therefore eventually our juice quite a lot. So, but that's not sort of the end of the story with potassium. So now we've brought it into our cells. Once we sort of start our fermentations, we break those cells open when we break our grapes open, and we release that potassium. Now, the more you break your skin cells open, the more you have that potassium release. So again, a lot of times we won't see this potassium initially in our juice samples because we haven't broken all those skins up yet. But once we sit on the skins for a longer time and those start to burst, we see those potassium levels really going up. Potassium is a micronutrient for yeast, and so we do have some consumption of the potassium as the yeast are working, which is good. Then the potassium leaves with the yeast bodies. And we also have precipitation of our potassium with bitartrate as we go on in the fermentation. So initially, bitartrate is a lot more, our potassium basically will go and find the tartrate ion that was left over when we got rid of our hydrogen ions, will form potassium bitartrate. And as the ethanol builds up, that becomes less and less soluble, and it starts to come out of solution. So if we sort of look at potassium through fermentation, we initially get this big hit as our skin cells are breaking down, but then eventually we sort of get some of that coming out through this precipitation of potassium bitartrate. So again, that reduces potassium. It also starts to strip some of our tartrate out, which might have some sensory impacts as well, depending on how much we're stripping out along the way. So we're basically left with this wine whose pH and potassium has a lot to do with what's already happened in the berries and these processes that have happened during fermentation. And unfortunately, in the case of Petit Verdot, we tend to be left with a wine at the end that has high potassium and that essentially has a high pH along the way. So, what do you do? Most of the time we're adding tartaric acid. But the problem is our tartaric acid additions are really, the efficacy of those additions are really affected by how much potassium we have in the environment itself. So we think I'm adding all this acid, so I should be decreasing my pH. But the amount of pH decrease that I get really depends on how much potassium is in there to begin with. Because again, we have all that potassium. If I'm adding tartaric acid, some of that potassium is going to find the tartrate anion and precipitate back out, just like we saw happen during fermentation. And it turns out that the effect of that precipitation might actually raise our pH, or it might actually lower our pH, depending on a couple of circumstances. So I think it's helpful to think about it this way when we just think, okay, I'm going to add tartaric acid. So if we see the tartaric acid at the top here, when that tartaric acid is in solution, immediately it starts to sort of dissociate into a dynamic equilibrium of 3 types. So it might stay as tartaric acid. It might give up 1 proton and become bitartrate ion, or it might give up 2 protons and become tartrate anion. And the amount or the proportion we have of either of those, of any of those, is dependent on the pH of the solution. So if we're sort of on the left-hand side of our graph here, we have a lot more tartaric acid and a lot less tartrate ion. If we're on the right-hand side, we have the opposite effect. At wine pH, we tend to have a whole lot of bitartrate. That's actually the form that our potassium is going to bind to. So when our potassium binds to our bitartrate ion, that comes out of solution in that same crystallization thing. But remember, we have to keep the same proportion. So that actually gets replaced from the other 2 sides. And which side is replacing it depends on the pH of the solution. So if we're over on the left-hand side, we get replaced by tartaric acid. The good news about that is in order for tartaric acid to become bitartrate, it has to give up a hydrogen ion. When it does that, it drives down the pH of your solution. So in this case, the precipitation there is actually moving the pH in the direction we want it to go. Unfortunately, if we're on the other side of the graph, if we're on the left or the right-hand side of the graph, we have to be replacing mostly from our tartrate ion. If we're doing that, we actually have to pick up a hydrogen ion from the solution, which means that our pH goes up. So it is possible in some situations to add tartaric acid and actually have your pH go up because you have all of this precipitation going on along the way. So, what do you do about that? How can you tell what you're supposed to do with all of that? The Australian Wine Research Institute has a really nice kind of extension paper that they did about this. And their recommendation was really to acidulate your must so that so at the fermentation stage, to acidulate so your pH is less than 3.5, as long as your TA is less than 7.5. So if you're checking TAs and pHs, most of the time for us to get to that pH, our TA is going to go way higher than that. So what do? Turns out they tell you to acidulate more. They say acidulate then to 3.4. And that could be a really huge add. You could be adding up to like 4 grams per liter. But what they're saying is that if your pH it needs to be acidulated and your T is already that high, you probably have a fair amount of potassium, and you can expect you're going to get a lot more of this out. But adding 4 grams per liter at the crusher can feel kind of scary. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about a couple of different options for how to look at this question. So keep that number in mind. Okay, so one last thing about this before we jump into our experiments for the day. When I was looking at all these potassium numbers, I kept thinking, what's normal? I just don't have like a range of calibration for that. So I started to just find anything I could find in the literature or by talking to people. So when we look at fruit samples, I talked to Rich at ETS, and he basically sent me all their potassium numbers for the last 5 years in California. And those averaged about 1850 milligrams per liter. Those would still be considered high potassium samples. And he said that they saw anything from a range from 800 to 3000, but they're averaging really what would still be considered to be high. They have pretty high pHs too in some situations. When Roger Bolton was doing his work on this, he said anything higher than 1500. And again, the AWR, what I work is working specifically with high potassium grapes, and they're in sort of the 1800 to 3600 range. So when we see those numbers, maybe above 1500 or 1600, we're dealing with high potassium grapes. There's also some papers that just sort of take a bunch of wines and look at the potassium in those wines. And really there, it seems like the cutoff is somewhere about 1200 or a little bit above would be considered a higher potassium wine. Okay, so if you're at 1200, you're kind of right on the cusp there. Okay, so keeping all of this in mind, we had a couple of experimenters this year that wanted to start to think about managing, sort of addressing the potassium in their Petit Verdot as a way of managing their acidity. So we'll go ahead and jump into that now. So our first experimenter to talk about his experiment is Matthieu Finot. So let me go ahead, Matthieu, and I will spotlight you so you can go to the front there. So this really was a kind of a 2-year odyssey that you had with this approach. So Matthieu, tell us a little bit about the approach you've been taking the last couple of years and sort of your rationale behind doing that.
So the idea was to try to create the protein and stability, the tartaric and stability. So to do a cold stabilization earlier on the wine, to see if it's going to help my pH earlier in the aging. In fact, not waiting too long to realize that, I wanted to monitor the pH level and see if I can, by doing the cold stabilization on the red, things that I never do usually, see if I'm doing a cold stabilization on the red, I can stabilize my my pH to something more acceptable and not having a very, very high TA.
So, and I remember when I first, basically this came up when I went to visit Matthieu after the 2019 harvest. We talked about his experiments, and he's like, I also did this other thing on the side. Do you want to hear about it? And I always say yes to that. And basically the idea when we talked about this, there was that idea that you're doing these ads and you're still sort of you're doing these ads after fermentation and still not seeing the result that you think that you're going to get in terms of the pH and the TA. So the idea was to use cold stabilization after fermentation to take the potassium out in order to try to then sort of get more efficacy from those tartaric acid additions. So in 2019, the way that looked, it was wine that was all fermented as a single lot. It was after alcoholic fermentation. It was basically separated into free run and press fraction. And then each of those was separated into 2 to become a control and a treatment. But really the only treatment was done on one of the press fractions, where that half of the press fraction was cold stabilized for 8 days as a way of trying to pull the potassium out through cold stabilization. And then Matthieu basically, as per what he does in his cellar, he recombined those at the same sort of proportion. So I think it was roughly about 80% free run and 20% press fraction. So he had a control where not everything was the same. And then he had a treatment where he had the cold stabilized press fraction instead of the non-cold stabilized press fraction. And what he found that year was immediately after the cold stabilization, he did get a little bit of benefit in his pH. And then with that 1.5, he did a 1.5 gram per liter addition of tartaric. And it seems like he got a little bit more efficacy for that. So he could sort of be aging at about between 3.85 and 3.9, as opposed to above 4. But the most interesting thing I think that we saw from that was we did take the potassium numbers, and the potassium from cold stabilization was already much lower, and it changed less through aging, meaning that we would expect to see less change in that wine over time as it's sitting in the cellar for a much longer period of time. This data was only taken after 4 or 5 months, and Matthieu ages for a lot longer than that. So this was our preliminary information. And then this year we wanted to sort of dig into that a little bit more. So Matthieu, tell us how you sort of worked, how this was adjusted for this year.
So this year, one of the issues is when you're in middle of harvest, or not middle of harvest, but at the end of harvest, you're pressing a wine, you try to separate the press fraction, and you try to do a cold stabilization on them, to get fairly good cold stabilization on a wine during harvest. You need at least like a week. So then you're gonna have a tank like 4 weeks, gonna be that you're going to try to cool down, and it wasn't really practical to do that on a bigger scale. So one of the idea was to use the cream of tartar to seed the tank, and by using the seed of the cream of tartar, hoping that my time will be much shorter. So it will be just only 1 day of getting the press fraction cold to do the cold stabilization. There were a couple of problems. I will probably talk more about the problem, but one of my issue at the end is like when you really start reading literature for cream of tartar addition, you need to add a lot of cream of tartar to get the precipitation going, especially on wine that's slightly got some turbidity and everything like that. And so, when we're talking about cream of tartar is expensive, it's almost as expensive as tartaric acid. So there's really not no money saving into doing this process. Financially, it's even more work and more expensive than just adding tartaric acid into the wine.
So yeah, so we were looking at it and saying, how can we really goose that cold stabilization, because cold stabilizing reds is a little bit harder than whites. There's a lot of cofactors that help to hold the tartaric or the potassium bitartrate in solution, so it doesn't come out as easily. So you can see a picture here of what that setup looked like. So Matthieu has his press fraction. He's got his cold paddle in there because it's a small lot, so it doesn't really get up into the jackets of a big tank. And you can see the hose kind of attached here. So that was after the cream of tartar seeding. Then there was agitation. I think it was like 3 hours or something. So that's kind of how the experiment was set up. The other thing that we did here also was acidulating the press fraction itself. So thinking back to that chemistry of where you're replacing your bitartrate from, you want to be on the right side of, or on the left-hand side of that graph that we were just showing. So there was an acidulation of the press fraction prior to cold stabilization in order to kind of try to get any replacement of our protons from the tartaric acid fraction, so that would help our pH. Both of these were acidulated though, just to keep the control as a control and say this is just about the cold stabilization, not just about that acidulation. But again, to acidulate to 3.6, you'll see in a minute, this was a big acidulation. It was about, I think we said it was like 2.6 grams per liter add. But again, it's only to 20% of the juice. So it felt a little bit easier to get yourself to do that at that stage. Okay, so we'll look at the information from this one, and then there's actually one other iteration of this. So if we look at the fruit chemistry, again, this is not fruit chemistry you would normally think, oh, I need to acidulate that, right? You're at pH of 3.2, your TA is at 7.8. But if you look over to the right-hand side here, the potassium is still pretty high. And again, that's in a really early sample. That's not after a lot of cold soak or skin contact or anything else. That's really pretty early on. So that gives us the clue that we're gonna end up having that sort of pH drift that we see in our Petit Verdots. And that was indeed the case. So the fermentation curve we looked at earlier for pH is the one that was for this lot. So again, you can see even within the first couple of days, there's this huge shooting up of the pH, which continues throughout fermentation. So again, as those skin cells start to break down and sort of put all of their stuff out in there, we see that pH going up really fast. If we look at what happens after the completion of fermentation, after pressing, we can see that this is just at the end of alcoholic fermentation. We're already above 4 with both the free run and the press fraction. The potassium is still pretty high. So again, that number that we got at 1800, there was most likely a lot more potassium that came out. And I think a telling thing here is to look at the tartaric acid number. We were at about 6 in the juice, and now we're about 2.3. So you've already taken a whole lot of tartaric acid out of solution with that potassium that was coming through. So then that press fraction, that second line, was acidulated. With acidulating the press fraction before it was cold stabilized, we can already see, of course, our pH is at 3.6, but look what happened to the potassium. The potassium went down already. So most likely that tartaric acid that we're adding is already starting to precipitate out even without the cold there. And we can see now it's actually very unstable. So the percent conductivity change tells us this is a pretty unstable wine at this point. Once it was cold stabilized, we can see that we got a little bit more potassium coming out. We didn't actually get that much more coming out. And we got a little bit of shift in tartaric acid, but not that much. So this basically tells us our cold stabilization is either not going completely to the end, or it's just maybe there's too many cofactors holding all of that in position. And unfortunately, when we sort of recombined everything, we didn't get any difference in chemistry between the control lot that didn't have cold stabilized press fraction and the treatment lot that did. So in this case, it may be just that 80% isn't enough to change anything, or it might be that we're really not getting enough of a change in that press fraction to really get the effect that we were looking for here. But we did continue to look at what's happening with throughout aging. So we did take chemistry again in February, and we took chemistry again in April. In this case, we have multiples because Matthieu kept multiple barrels of them. So we just wanted to track what was going on in each of those barrels. And again, we can see there were additional tartaric acid additions there. And we don't see much of a difference between our control and our treatment. So in this case, that treatment wasn't really working. But I do think that we can continue to see what's going on with potassium as we're doing our aging. And I made a graph of this because I think it's easier to see. If we look at our tartaric acid at the end of combination, we had about 2.3 grams per liter of tartaric acid in both of those. We added about 1.5 grams per liter. So our predicted tartaric acid would be between 3.5 and 4. But when we looked at the finished wine, it was at like 2.1. So throughout aging, we just kept losing that tartaric acid out of solution because there was still all that potassium in there to form our potassium bitartrate. And that's confirmed when we look at our potassium numbers. So we started with our potassium up in the 1800s at the end of fermentation. At the end of aging, we're still sort of down at about 1300. So we're still getting that drift during aging, which means you just have to keep going back to it and keep checking it again and keep checking it again. So in this case, that cold stabilizing the little fraction maybe wasn't enough. But Matthieu, you did another experiment where you had a slightly different setup. So tell us what happened with PV-TV.
So on the other PV, I was trying to, there was something that was done, not supposed to be done in the cellar, but they've combined the press fraction directly with the free run. So I decided to do the cold stabilization on the entire tank. Also maybe being a bit more easier to manage on the winery side, because then you do a cold stabilization on a bigger lot, and just try to see if that will also work. I think the result is fairly similar, so we don't see much difference, but it was easier to manage.
Yeah, so in this case, it was maybe a fortuitous accident in the sense that it wasn't planned this way, but this is the way that we ended up getting it done. I will say that this cold stabilization did not include that acidulation. And did you see this cold stabilization, Matthieu?
No, yes, I did see okay. The cold stabilization. Yes. Yeah, so
this one still got.
It was seeded, but I didn't bring the pH below 3.6 because then again, if you end up adding
Yeah, that makes that addition a lot scarier to do, right? When you have to keep the whole lot that way. So then when we look at the chemistry there, the juice chemistry here is the second one. So we can see that, again, this isn't something that you would normally be trying to cold stabilize. And then, let's see, oops. The clicker's not working. When we look at the chemistry sort of after fermentation was done and after cold stabilization, again, at the end of fermentation, it did, end up with this really high pH. The tartaric acid, once again, totally fell out. We still have a lot of potassium. And unfortunately, it wasn't very cold unstable to begin with. So we don't have, with a conductivity number as what we're seeing in the control there, the cold stabilization probably didn't have very far to go, just because at that point it wasn't that unstable. And so unfortunately, in this case, we didn't really see it moving at that point either. And then again, when we look what's happening during aging, just to see if we see that same same pattern going on. Again, we had some tartaric acid addition, which did move the pH a little bit, but we see that potassium coming down, and we see when we look at it, our tartaric acid a lot of that tartaric acid does continue to sort of precipitate out. So unfortunately, this was a lot of work, and the approach itself didn't work. But Matthieu, I feel like we learned a lot about what was happening with the potassium as we went along that might give us some insight into how to handle these in the future.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it was very interesting at the end. I didn't succeed into what I was trying to do, but it's if we don't try, we don't fail. So that was good. There were two questions. One question from Kirsty regarding my target pH. My target pH is I'd like to get my PV once. I used to try to get it around like 3.7, like normal red wine, but I've stopped fighting it. 3.7 is too low for a PV. Very often the T end up to be still a little bit too high, and the acid perception is too important. So now if I get 3.8, I'm fairly satisfied with as a finished wine. I'm fairly satisfied as a pH for the PV. The other question I think was from Carl regarding malolactic fermentation. I mean, the wine is going to warm back up anyway after the cold stabilization, so there's no problem with malolactic fermentation on the cold stabilized wine. I don't even think I've seen any difference in speed of the malolactic fermentation. So getting it cold not going to kill your bacteria.
And you do all ambient malolactic, so you're not
yes,
you're not inoculating it. So it's not even that you're like crashing it all out and having less microbes coming in. You just basically there's enough resident in the winery that it gets done.
Yeah, I'm sure my barrels are full of bacteria in some way or another, and so I never had any problem.
So any parting thoughts? We didn't end up tasting this because there weren't differences in the flavors, and so we didn't end up doing any sensory difference here. But any closing thoughts for you, Matthieu, as you kind of think about insights from potassium as you went through this?
Again, I mean, it's weird because I've got one vineyard where I've got some potassium deficiency, and I see it every year. You see it on the leaf, so I know I've got a potassium deficiency on this vineyard, and that's the only Petit Verdot where I don't need to add acid. It's like pH post malolactic fermentation 3.6 with no acid addition, but I've got only one site like this, so it's definitely there's no rule about what to do, but again, the more it goes, the more I think like doing early acid addition in the must is probably the best way to go. And even if it's scary when you've got a pH that's 3.25 and says that you're going to add 2 or 3 grams of tartaric acid into the PV, doesn't make much sense. But if you keep working with the same vineyard, and if you know your vineyard, even if you don't test your potassium every time, I still think it's better to go big at the beginning than trying to do a lot of small addition. And
that's a perfect segue into our next experiment. So thank you for that. So as we sort of as we go into the next experiment, I think we're left with this question, like, what are we to do? Because Petit Verdot is we still want to be making Petit Verdot. So we, as part of sort of working with Matthieu on this, I did start to look into some of the literature, and the question is what do you do about it? We did see that the AWRI recommendations that you're sort of doing these pretty large additions early on, but as we said, it's really kind of scary to do a 4 gram per liter or bigger addition, especially as Matthieu just said, when your pHs look like they're pretty much in range. And most of us are not testing potassium in the winery. There's a couple of different methodologies for that. I've tried most of them and haven't really been able to get them to work so nicely for what most wineries have on hand. So thankfully, though, there's one bit of literature. Denise Gardner actually did try this approach on some Pennsylvania fruit when she was at Penn State. She had a lot of Merlot and a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon in 2015 that basically consistently had high pH problems from previous harvests. And so they did measure the potassium in the fruit that year. They were at about 1600 for both of the lots. And she's like, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and try adding these big acid additions and see what happens. And so in her Merlot lot, she added 2, 4, and 6 grams per liter at the crusher. 2 grams per liter was sort of normal for them. So she added 4 and 6. And then in the Cabernet Sauvignon, she did 5 and 6. I don't remember why there wasn't a 2. I think it was about how much fruit was around. But when she finished, when they finished fermentation, again, you can see what the juice pH looks here. The Merlot came in at 3.88, but adjusted, you get these really, really low pHs that look kind of scary and these high TAs that look kind of scary. But if you look at what's happening when they get to post-malolactic, they're at, with only 2 grams, they're at 3.96. So this definitely was a lot that would probably benefit from that early acid addition. It looks here that 4 grams per liter leaves her with some pretty nice chemistry. But again, the question is what does that do to your sensory? So they did do a little bit of informal sensory on this. It was pretty anecdotal, but what she said was they did notice a big color shift. So again, going from sort of the purple hues to the red hues, which we would expect with that difference in pH. The 2 grams per liter they felt was kind of flat. The 6 gram per liter was probably too sour. So the 4 gram per liter they thought had nice freshness and nice fruit character. But the problem is 4 grams per liter, it's not like a magic number in their Cabernet Sauvignon. Oops, I went one too far. In their Cabernet Sauvignon, they did a 5 and a 6. You can see their adjusted pHs are like in the 2.8 range, which is really scary. But even with that, with 4 grams per liter of an addition, they still end up at 3.82. So, but again, the question there is what does that do to the sensory? And so that's where Kirsty Harmon comes in. Kirsty was brave enough to try this for us. And so Kirsty, thank you for being brave enough to try this. Tell us a little bit about what your interest was in this question and then how you approached it with your experiment this year.
Sure. Well, every year I have Petit Verdot that comes in 3.3, 3.4, and every year I think maybe this is not the year that it goes to 4.2, but it goes to 4.2 every single time. So I thought, okay, I'm going to try an extreme experiment, and Joy was very instrumental in encouraging me to do so. So I thought, okay, fine, we're going to go with no acid versus 4 grams per liter of acid, which it feels crazy and looks crazy adding that amount to the macrobin. But I wanted to do it and to age it out and to see, is an early addition the right call for Petit Verdot?
So in this case, Kirsty did the experiment itself was very straightforward. So this was done on Petit Verdot that came from your vineyard, right? From Blenheim. Yep. Yeah. And so a couple of the bins got 0 grams per liter and a couple of the bins got 4 grams per liter of tartaric, and basically we just followed them through. So that you know what's in front of you, and that's the sensory that you have in front of you. So that you know what's going on as we're going through the chemistry. These are the codes for the wines that you have in front of you. So in case you're looking at a really small screen, I'm going to go ahead and read them off. If you're in group 1, wine 774 and 774 and 413 are control. Wine 585 is the treatment. If you're in group 2, wine 393 and 522 are treatment, and 305 is control. If you're in group 3, wine 295 is control, and 336 and 493 are treatment. And if you're in group 4, wine 726 and 571 are control. Wine 886 is the treatment. So in this case, control got 0 grams per liter of tartaric, and the treatment got the 4 grams per liter at the crusher. So we'll come back to the sensory in just a minute, but let's take a look at the chemistry real quick before we do that. So The fruit chemistry, as Kirsty said, again, you kind of have this fruit chemistry that's like, I'm not sure I need to acidulate this, but by her experience, Kirsty knew that even though this is what her pH looks like, after crushing, it doesn't end up like that in the end. You might think adding 4 grams per liter at the crusher would affect your fermentation in some way. Kirsty uses a really robust yeast. She's using EC 1118, and it will blow right through that 4 grams per liter with no problem. So it did that. The pH shift did not seem to have an effect at all on our fermentation kinetics. When we look at what's happening with the acidity through time, on this graph, any of the green lines represent what's happening in the control, and the orange lines represent what's happening in the treatment. The lighter lines are the pH and the darker lines are the TA. So if we look at the control pH, we can see that it sort of does that same thing that we saw in Matthieu's, that even though we're starting in sort of the 3.3-ish range, very quickly very quickly it shoots up, and it continues to go up as we go through fermentation. So Kirsty's ending fermentation, or I'm sorry, ending malolactic on the sort of above 4.0. Whereas in the treatment, you can see where the acid addition was done, where the pH dips down. And by the end of malolactic, she was sort of at about 3.65. And that tended to hold through aging. So that sort of pH benefit in terms of microbial stability, in terms of color fixation, and eventually through aging of the molecular sulfur, the efficacy of her molecular sulfur, she basically got that benefit from the very beginning. We can see on the TAs that the TA did get very high there after the addition. But at the same time, most of that was lost as we sort of went down through the rest of through malolactic fermentation, and then through aging, we did see a significant decline in the TAs over time. When we look at the actual chemistry, again, Kirsty was able to keep 3 barrels of each for us, so we could make sure that whatever was happening consistently in all 3 barrels. We do see a very big change in the pH as a result of this big upfront addition. So she's aging more at about 3.6 as opposed to over 4. And we can see the effect of that sort of on all of the chemistry, but I think notably on the molecular sulfur. So with relatively similar free sulfurs, she's getting a much more effective molecular sulfur. And we can even see that effect on the volatile acidity. So there does seem to be lower volatile acidity in the treated versus the untreated, which makes sense. You have both just the antimicrobial effect of the pH itself, plus the antimicrobial effect of the molecular sulfur. And those tended to stay stable over time. So we didn't see a huge difference in sort of the additional 3 or 4 months of aging there. When we look at the potassium numbers, this is just taken at the end. So these were taken in April. We can see that there's a huge shift in the potassium there essentially with that tartaric acid addition. So the tartaric acid is almost acting as a fining agent here to take a bunch of that potassium out of solution. So with potassium levels as high as 1900, even if Kirsty had been adding tartaric acid to her control wine, she probably would have been losing a fair amount of that addition just because that potassium would take it back out. And again, she added 4 more grams of tartaric acid, but when we look at the tartaric acid in the finished wine, it's really not that different. So most of that was probably being effectively taken out fairly early on. And then the last thing I wanted to look at was the result of these acid trials. Kirsty was kind enough to sort of do some acid trials for us, both at the beginning of fermentation, right before fermentation, and then also later on. And I think this tells us something about sort of trying to predict what's going to happen. So on her must, when she added 4 grams per liter and got to about a pH of about 3.23, her acid trial would have predicted she would only need 1 gram per liter to do that. And so again, that's just telling us that the chemistry that we're getting from our grapes right at crushing isn't really telling us the whole story in terms of what's happening with our potassium and our potential acidity along the way. And then the last one, we wanted to figure out if she was to bring the control wine to the same pH as the treatment wine, how much would she need to add? And at that point, it looked like she needed to add about 2.25 grams. So we can think about what the sensory effect of adding 2.25 grams later in the life of the wine might be. And we can maybe compare, we can try to think what that would be and then compare that to the difference that we did see here. So all of that to say, you know, that's what the chemistry looks like, but ultimately the sensory is really the question that we have along the way here. So right, we'll go to our discussion in just a second, but before we do that, I did want to say, you know, we had this question about Petit Verdot varietal character, and I think we all sort of have in our mind's eye what we think Petit Verdot is supposed to be like, but just to put some specific words to that, if we kind of look at what I'm not sure Wine Folly is the literature, but this was just a nice picture to show. But some of the characteristics we would expect to find in Petit Verdot are really some plumminess and some black cherries, so some of those dark red fruits. It does tend to have some floral character to it, but also a little bit of herbal character. But when we look at the sort of color taste profile, we also have to remember this is supposed to be a big wine. So it's supposed to be something with a lot of body and tannin, and kind of a lot of punch along the way. So when we talk about varietal character, just a couple of descriptors to go by. So if you need a refresher on what's in front of you, go ahead and do that. And then if you could turn your cameras on, I will stop sharing my screen. Let's see, I'll stop sharing. And then hopefully we can see everybody. So if you can turn your cameras on for discussion, that would be great. Get my notes. Okay, so in this case, if we can see you visually, if you could just raise your hand and keep it up if you were able to tell the difference between the wines. If I can't see your camera, then maybe you can use that raise your hand function so that we can still do kind of a visual overview. So again, keep your hands up so that I can see you because I have to go between galleries at this point. So. Okay, so a fair number of folks were able to see. Oh, and I see two. I thank you, Lost Creek, for giving me two hands on both sides there. Excellent. Okay, so for those of you, you can put your hands down. Thank you. For those of you that were able to tell the difference between the wines, tell me what was like the main difference that you were picking up. And if it was just acidity, we can make sure that we say that. But especially, I'm looking. Were there differences other than just the perceived difference in acidity? So what were the differences that you picked up in those wines?
Joy and Kirsty, for me, the control was a bit softer and rounder. I think because of the lower acidity, and of course we make different decisions on when a wine's going to be released and hitting market, and if it's going to be blended or not. But just judging the two wines side by side, I preferred the control for that reason, and I thought you did a good job of keeping it kind of clean and healthy in a more risky set of circumstances.
Thank you, Michael. Okay. Other comments on the differences between the wines?
I picked up cherry in the aroma really intensely in the treated wine and non-existent in the untreated.
Okay, great. So that would be a sort of a difference in that fruit intensity, much like what we saw with Denise's work. Okay, other differences. Jackie is saying that the control is more textural. So is that, Jackie, do you mean like astringency, or is it like the tannin structure itself?
Sorry, I stole Jackie's computer. That was my comment.
Oh,
gotcha. So yeah, no, I think with what Michael was saying, there was more of a softener to us. It felt rounder on the palate. I think the control did.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Okay. Other comments on the differences between these two wines? Okay, so let's try the next one. So so again, if I can, I don't know how to do this one if I can't see you, so hopefully I can see you. So when we think about Petit Verdot varietal character, I want you to tell me, just hold up your hand if you feel like we'll ask for the control first and then the treatment that had like not a lot of varietal character, you're gonna hold up a 1. If you feel like it was very Petit Verdot, you're gonna give me 5, and anywhere in between. All right, so, and keep your hands up so I can see them. So Petit Verdot varietal character in the control. Okay, I see a couple 4s, 5s, 4s and 5s. Let me come over here. 3s, 2s. Okay, so we're sort of in that range. Okay, how about for the treatment? So Petit Verdot varietal character in the treatment. Okay, so this is interpreted. This is interesting. Okay, so there are several of you that sort of went from high Petit Verdot varietal character in the control to less in the treatment. So tell me, what about the character shifted for you? What was it that you're like, this doesn't seem Petit Verdot-y to me anymore?
I think that the control was just more generous and had more clear fruit, whereas the treated wine was just tight, lean, acidic, and I got more of a dry red character. Like it just exactly not particularly varietal. It was just like more detail and just easier to see.
Okay.
Control.
Yeah, I think it was like a body and texture kind of thing. The one that was the treated one, the acid was just sticking out so much that it just kind of made it so much more linear, and you had a rounder and a fullness and the weight you would expect for the control.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one major difference, like a fundamental difference for me, was dark opulent and rich berries, or opulent and rich berries in the control, as opposed to just bright red berry.
Right. Yeah.
In the treatment.
Well, I'm completely opposite of all of you.
Okay, so
I
Rick,
thought
tell
that
us what you think.
I mean, I must have gotten myself in my normal confused state. I thought that the control was kind of flat, and the word linear does come to mind for that one for me. And as I went through and tasted, I was organized this time. I tasted before and I tasted during. So as I tasted the experiment, the treated one, I got much more of a richness of sweetness and blueberries that I would associate with Petit Verdot.
Okay.
So, but I had
I'm
chili
in
for
your
lunch.
camp, Rick.
I was going to ask you.
Oh, Jeanette, you grace me with your presence.
I was going to ask you, because you had a big difference.
I'm muting myself now.
Yeah. Anything you would add to what Rick just said?
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I thought the control was extremely astringent, and I did not pick that up in the treated wine. Yeah, and it's funny, I had them all sitting here with the little solo caps on top, and I asked my boyfriend, I said, come smell these and tell me if you can pick out which one is different. And he picked the treatment also, and he said, oh, I would drink this long before I would drink the other two. It was just a lot more aromatic.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. So we did sort of do, so we have a demo wine as well. So the demo wine, we were sort of, when Kirsty and I were tasting this together, I think we started to talk too about, what's the fate of this wine? So Kirsty, for you, what's the fate of this wine?
This wine gets bottled at the start of July. So it's a very quick turnaround for me. And as a standalone wine, I would feel really uncomfortable bottling the acidified or the treatment wine as Petit Verdot. For me personally, the style of wine that I'm hoping to go for. I found the control much more Petit Verdot-y to me, based on what I think Petit Verdot is. So we were looking at how, now I have these 8 barrels, 4 of each. What the heck do we do with them? So we were looking at the possibility of blending them and seeing. We figured that might be a question that you guys would have. Okay, so you have some that you acidify, some that you don't. What does it taste like in a blend? And so that's why we gave you the demo wine.
Yeah, so the demo is a 50-50 blend of the two. And I think we were sort of thinking, did we go too far? Is there somewhere between 0 and 4 that we could still get some of the benefit, but maybe not getting all of it? So it's an imperfect test because we don't know what would happen if we had given 2 at the crusher. But we did want to sort of see what that sensory result was. So that's why you've got your 50-50, or the demo itself is 50-50. So we'll talk in a minute about maybe some things to try in the future. But So that's what the demo is. So any thoughts on the demo wine relative to the other two? Those of you that liked the one, do you feel like the demo wine still gives you that if you liked the other? One of the things we talked about when Kirsty and I were meeting as well is that, because she's bottling this right away, it's a different, that we're relatively soon. So Kirsty bottles everything out within the year. Then you kind of do have to get ready for market a little bit sooner. Whereas if you're thinking about putting this down into a barrel and letting it age for another year, that pH concern of being at that higher pH is a little bit more, because you just have a lot more opportunity for microbial spoilage, but you also have more time for that acid to integrate. So you might be making different decisions there depending on what's happening with your Petit Verdot along the way. So Michael Henney says the demo's great and it's ready for market. And I would actually think, I think that the 50-50 is this really nice kind of balance of the two. I do tend to like my reds a little bit acidic, but with Petit Verdot, it just seems to stand out quite a lot. So other thoughts on the 50-50 split? Okay, so if you had to choose, we're going to do one more sort of raise your hand. So if you had to choose which one of these you were going to do, which approach you were going to take, if you want the control wine, give me a 1. If you want the treatment wine, give me a 2. And if you want the demo wine, give me a 3. So if you were to choose which one of these you like the best, control, treatment, or demo. Okay, so we still have some control folks there. We've got some demo there. We've got some treatment folks there. Wow, we've got, so in the end there, and you're not volunteering for anything, but I see you, those of you that would be willing to do 4 grams per liter. So if anybody would like to follow this up with some experimentation of your own next year, as Kirsty will attest, this is something that's fairly straightforward to do as long as you have a couple of T-bins of the same thing. So if you're interested in sort of working with that, please let me know. So Kirsty, as we sort of are wrapping up, what are you thinking about doing, experimentally and in your winemaking going forward?
So this has made me want to look at acid from start to finish and understand the best time to add acid. I struggle with the decision to add acid, to not add acid, and the timing, whether it's better to do it at crush, after malolactic, or right before bottling. I generally don't do it right before bottling. So my experimentation this year will be completely focused on timing of acid additions in reds.
Great. I look forward to working with you on how to get that, how to figure out how to do those. And I would say that, again, for any of the rest of you, if you're interested in joining Kirsty in that odyssey, please let us know, and we would love to include you. You don't have to go all the way to 4 grams per liter. We can do this with 2 grams per liter. If you prefer to do a little bit more conservative add, we can definitely sort of do baby steps into whatever we think would work the best. So, okay, any other comments before we wrap up?
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Ask a question really quick. So I've heard that using foliar magnesium during the growing season, that magnesium will kind of help outcompete the potassium in lower pHs.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about that, and why would that be, and what do you know about that?
So there's a competitive uptake between magnesium and potassium. So we talked about what's going on in the roots, but that there's also sort of a trade-off of what's happening at the grape level. So having more magnesium around might, like you said, it just sort of might offset that a little bit. I don't know if that really works with the levels of potassium that we're using in Virginia. So I would actually open that question out to the group. Has anybody tried that approach and seen that as being efficacious?
Yeah, it doesn't work. I've tried several times, and you don't get anything out of it. It's I've tried. It doesn't change anything. It didn't change my pH. It doesn't change anything on the finished wine.
Okay. So that might be one of those things that works if you don't have too much, but because we just have this overabundance, it's just really hard to kind of overcome that just with a foliar spray. So, and I realized, go ahead, Joyce.
Well, with adding magnesium to the soil, doesn't seem to affect it because there's so much potassium. That's been my experience. So I usually add magnesium foliarly because the vine needs it, because I'll see magnesium deficiency symptoms. And so I just start adding magnesium you know, at the beginning of the season. And also I did some research because I got into a huge argument with a soil guy from Virginia Tech that swore that the only way that the vine is going to get magnesium is through the roots. Well, once you do the research, and I found some published articles that said that foliarly, you're only uptaking about 0.3% of the magnesium. So that's why you keep applying it each spray instead of just one time and think your situation is done. So I had to go and search for that answer because he embarrassed me in front of about, 100 people. When I was doing a talk, he kept saying, wait a minute. So anyway, I was glad to find the actual answer to that. So
yeah, so if you are going to do it, you have to do it. You have to keep doing it because the uptake is not very good. Right.
But I mean, I can see, I did 2 years in a Pennsylvania vineyard that the first year I waited too late to add the magnesium, and I took pictures, and by June 15th, the Chamberson, who's the canary in the coal mine for magnesium deficiency, was really showing it. The next year I started adding right away, took the same picture, the same area, and this beautiful green leaves, no problem. So I'm really sold on adding magnesium that way.
So I guess the question that remains is that amount of magnesium addition, like thankfully it's enough to offset the magnesium deficiency, but is that actually helping your potassium at all?
I don't see how it could, because it's a different pathway. I mean, the roots are what's bringing in the potassium.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
We had one other question that I didn't get to before, and Andrew, I'm sorry that it took so long to get to your question. He did have a question earlier on. Do you find that there's more variation of pH and TA in fruit samples from year to year than in the finish point? So, so this is a good question, I think, for anybody that makes Petit Verdot, but especially for Matthieu and Kirsty. Like Kirsty, you were saying, when you're seeing these numbers, like, do you have more variation in what you're getting in your fruit samples than, like, you're always ending up with high pH regardless of what the fruit sample pH is looking like?
Yeah, it always starts at 3, somewhere between 3.3 and 3.5, and without fail, if I don't add any acid, it always goes to above 4, sometimes 4.2. Yeah, I've never looked at potassium levels, and so I would love to at least have the possibility to look at potassium levels in thinking about acid additions. I just don't know how practical or financially viable that is.
So I'm the same. I mean, again, except one specific vineyard that I know I should not add acid, because this one's not, my pH is not going up. Everything else I know it's going to go up. And the thing, like, very often, it's funny because I went through that more than once. You talk to somebody and they've got like 3.2 pH, and they're like, oh, I'm not going to, or 3.3, and they're like, oh, I'm not going to acidify. And if they don't do it, then they're going to be above 4. It happens almost every time, and you don't have to worry about having a high TA and low pH at harvest, because again, like Kirsty's experimentation show, you're going to drop the total acidity is going to drop down fairly quickly during the fermentation. So
yeah,
that's really interesting, because like in Virginia, I've seen like very different start points of Petit Verdot. Like, for example, in 2020, I think that we had something like 3.1 and 11, and it ended up at your nice 3.8 and 6 or whatever it is. And I haven't got enough historical data with this particular vineyard, but my California experience, which was all pretty much north of that 3.65, we found that site was the major driver of whether we would add or not. So we collected a lot of historical data, and we check it along the way, but mostly we mostly knew that, this particular lot, regardless of the variety or whatever, from the historical data needed 2 grams or needed 1 gram or whatever, and we kind of disregard the numbers. We'd keep them for a record and but give it a little bit of a checkup at the end of fermentation, but we'd mostly arrive at the right number post-malic with what the addition that the historical data recommended.
Yeah. One other thing so Karen wrote into the chat that when she was in California, it was common to basically acidify the red wines at the crusher for microbial protection, but then de-acidify when necessary, sort of before bottling. And she points out, and I think this would be my experience too, that de-acidification with potassium bicarbonate it sort of has its own flavor profile to it. But I would also say that in the Denise Gardner paper, that was what they were doing in Pennsylvania as well, with some of these really big additions. So they would do the big addition early on, and then with the understanding that they may need to de-acidify on the other side of it. So that's something to consider. And Todd writes in, and we saw this actually when we looked at the Lost Creek information, the Lost Creek data, when we looked at the ambient fermentation data, is that they are able to do potassium on their FOSS wine scan. So if you're in Northern Virginia and you're looking for some way to measure your potassium, the FOSS will do potassium. The other ways to do those in the winery, there is a Unitech kit to do that enzymatically, but unfortunately, you can't like break it down into little smaller bits to do like 3 at a time or 5 at a time. You sort of have to do the whole thing, which makes it very difficult to get done. There is a potassium probe that I actually purchased for the WRE a couple of years ago, but it has proven to be like nearly impossible to get it calibrated. So I will take another, I will take another journey through trying to get that done. I think the easiest thing would be like, hey, if I could have just a probe that I could go ahead and do that, that would be great. But unfortunately right now, at least the probe that we purchased, the calibration seems to be a pretty tricky situation. So those are the ways that I know to do that. But as Todd said, the FOSS system is able to do that as part of their juice panel. So if you're using that juice panel, you should have those data coming through as well. And we did get some really nice data from the Lost Creek. And when we looked at the Lost Creek data for the ambient fermentations, we saw that same thing, that the pHs would jump up during cold soak and that the potassiums would jump up during cold soak, which is kind of what we're seeing in the first couple of days of fermentation in these other experiments that don't do cold soak. So, okay, so we are over time at this point. So I do want to make sure to honor your time and wrap up, but any other last minute things to say about any of these or other ideas of ways of dealing with potassium in our Petit Verdots? We will keep picking at this question over the years, but if you have any insights, we would love to hear those and put those into practice with some experiments. So, okay, so let me go ahead and thank the Virginia Wine Board, as always, for funding our project. We are, again, funded for next year, like I said, so that means that we can come around and start planning our experiments. Thanks to Matthieu and to Kirsty for doing these experiments and being willing to share the results with us. And thanks to each one of you for tasting the experiments, doing your sensory sheets, and participating in our discussion today. I really appreciate you coming again and again into our virtual format, and really look forward to seeing you in person sometime soon. So I will see you when I see you. If I don't see you before harvest, I wish you all the best, but hopefully we'll see you before that. So thanks everybody for coming.